Hi, I'm Jeffrey Martin. In this session, we're going to take a look at biosignals as they relate to transformative technology. Now, the first thing we have to realize is that this is not a new phenomenon. People have been using this for a very, very long time. For instance, on this slide are technologies that are able to induce physiological changes relating to transformation, well-being, healing, all sorts of different things. Let's look at just a few of these. First of all, in the corner you see people dancing around the fire. Well, what might surprise you is that some measurements have been done of ancient ceremonial fire pits, and it turns out that they produced a very specific light flicker rate for the participants who were outside the ring. So not the dancers, who probably had their own effects from movement and stuff like that, and who knows what substances or, what else might have been inducing it, a rhythm of the drum, all of that. But if you were just a bystander standing outside that ring as these people went around it, some of these fire pits have estimated to be 10 hertz flicker rates. So a 10 hertz flicker rate is basically a brainwave rhythm. And it's a brainwave rhythm that has been discovered in recent years as heavily relating to certain types of meditation and meditative states and things like relaxation and other stuff. So it seems like what we might be looking at here in some instances is a very deliberate state-changing technology. But it looks like just some sort of primitive ritual dancing around the fire. I'm sure if you were like me before encountering this information, you probably thought to yourself, well, probably the dancers are the ones getting some sort of change in their state of consciousness. But it could have also very well been the people that were watching. Interestingly, that same technology is still in use and being sold today. You look at the little symbol things in the middle of the screen. Well, those are Tibetan tingshas. And if you look at that lanyard, that piece of leather that connects the two of them, if you have a real version of these and you take them and you sort of cling them together, it turns out that if you hold the one to one ear and one to the other ear, they produce what's called a binaural beat effect. And a binaural beat effect, quite simply put, is, say, 110 hertz goes in this ear and 100 hertz goes in this ear, and your brain sort of cancels out the 100 and resonates to the 10 hertz. Again, these tingshas have been often shown to be 10 hertz in terms of what they are designed to induce in brainwave frequencies. Now, if you've seen these things in the West, you've probably seen them opening meditation sessions and closing meditation sessions, right? And someone will be like a little cling, right? And that'll be that. You probably didn't realize that they were one of the most sophisticated pieces of meditation technology ever invented. And meditation, in this case, of course, is directly relating to changes of consciousness, changes of your brainwaves, all of that. Drumming in the lower corner there, same thing. There's been all sorts of research on sound. In this case, this would be more of what we would call an isochronic tone versus a binaural beat. And it's just, a single tone. Both of our ears are hearing it at the same time. That can also drive brainwave and brainwave entrainment, so it can produce shifts of consciousness. Again, all of these technologies are currently on the market for sale. These are all current transformative technologies, even though in some cases they stretch back millennia in their usage, possibly to the earliest times of humans. So when we talk about transformative technology and we talk about using, biosignals and feedback and all of that type of stuff to drive the human nervous system, this is something that has been going on for a very long time. Here's what they looked like in the 60s and 70s and on into the 80s. There are a lot of devices that you can see on your screen that do very similar things to what we just talked about. More recently, here are some current ones, some contemporary ones that are out there that do a lot of those things and even more. And so we'll be talking about some of these and the signals associated with them and whatnot as we go on. It's been an interesting evolution from dancing around a fire to the things that you see on your screen right now. I want to talk about, first of all, some high-level categories so that, we have some buckets to sort of group these technologies in. And these slides, incidentally, come from a class that I taught inside of a class that Nicole and I taught at Stanford University for Stanford students. So not an extension class, but an actual Stanford class called Radical Human Technology. And this is one of the intro sessions to that class. So you're actually getting today a little bit of a Stanford class sneak peek. So I think it helps for us to begin by saying, how should we sort of cluster these technologies together, or how should we think of them? And I broadly think of them in these three ways: feedback, stimulation, or traditional tools that have been some way augmented with technology. So as a feedback type of tool, we usually cluster these in two ways. They either relate to neurological feedback, and so that is in some way providing you, it's reading your brain waves or reading something about what's going on in your nervous system, generally relating to the brain. So this could be functional magnetic resonance imaging or EEG, something like that. And then it's giving you something that you can look at that in some way tells you what's going on with part of your brain or part of your brain waves or whatever else. And by sort of interacting with whatever you're being shown or whatever you're listening to that's being driven by your brain waves or by a part of activity in your brain, if it's fMRI or something like that, you're able to learn to modulate whatever it is that's being measured. So this has been used in a lot of ways over the years, and every city has neurofeedback practitioners where you can go and try this out. They'll use usually relatively low channel count EEG machines that will measure the electrical signals coming off of your brain and going through your skull and through your muscle and scalp and all of that, and being read by little electrodes that'll sit right on the surface of your skin. Now, this type of technology, even though it's very, very widely deployed, has in fact been the realm of clinicians for quite a long time. And so you would go to a place and they would put the equipment on you and you would watch a screen and you would try to make a bar go up or down based on what you were trying to train to maybe, or maybe you would try to make a tone get louder or quieter, something like that. So feedback to this point, neurofeedback to this point, has been relatively simple, and so has other forms of biofeedback. And I'll have a whole list of other stuff in a minute that relates to biofeedback. But biofeedback can be things like measuring the conductivity of your skin or the temperature of your skin or something like that. Also, so feedback is reading, right? Feedback involves sort of a loop between reading a signal and then in some way exposing that signal to you, usually consciously, though not always. It can be something that's exposed to your system at an unconscious level to try to get your body to sort of make unconscious changes. And the whole point of it is generally to drive some sort of change. One interesting neurofeedback system, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what's an example of a subconscious type of thing? Well, there's a guy named Ottmer, Siegfried Ottmer, who in Los Angeles has a clinic, and he will wire you up with neuro or bio. It could go either way. He could use heart rate, or he could use EEG. Usually he uses EEG. But his equipment works with multiple signals, and he'll use what he feels is most appropriate for you. And so let's just say he's wired you up with the EEG, and he's put a couple of electrodes on the back of your head somewhere, and he's basically tuned his software to say, I want you to pay attention to these brainwave frequencies. Now, an interesting thing about him is that he uses super, super slow brainwave frequencies. And so most people believe that these can't even be very easily manipulated with feedback, because the reason is for a signal this slow, by the time you've reacted to it, the belief is that it's just too long for you to react to it, for your brain to actually entrain in any way. So he does something very clever. He has you sit in a nice, comfortable chair and watch a monitor, and he has a bunch of different things that you might see on the monitor. But an example of one is you might see a spaceship, and it might be sort of flying down the center of a complicated tube with, pipes going across it, so it's got to avoid them and stuff like that. And what you don't realize, because you're not told it, is that the speed of the ship is entirely determined by the brain waves that are being measured. And so let's say he wants more of a certain type of brainwave. More of a certain type of brainwave might make the ship speed up. Less of that brainwave might make the ship slow down. Now, it might not speed up a lot. It might only speed up a tiny little bit, or slow down a tiny little bit. In fact, as you're watching it, you might not even notice there's a difference, but your brain notices the difference in speed. He's got those thresholds set just right so that at a subconscious level, those changes are being picked up. And what's happening is your brain can enter into a subconscious learning loop with that ship on the screen just by sitting there watching the monitor. Your brain is literally learning how to control parts of itself that it never knew were there, never knew it could control, never was able to differentiate, however you want to think about that, staying at a relatively high level with this. And I think that's really an amazing example of that sort of subconscious or subliminal type of feedback. So we also have stimulation. Now, this is literally us putting something on your brain, for instance. So I might stick some electrodes on your head, and instead of measuring something, I might shoot some electricity into your brain. Or we might use something called transcranial ultrasound to put a sound wave, a sound pressure wave, into your brain, or something like that. And again, there's neurological versions of these, and there's biological versions of these. So a biological version might be something like vagus nerve stimulation, where we either electrically or acoustically stimulate the vagus nerve from outside your body, which is a very important nerve that does all kinds of stuff. It might also be just something like haptics, having a vibration that's generated that you feel on your skin, and getting you, either that vibration has been, determined over time to do something very specific, or maybe it's been associated in some sort of learning way with your nervous system. But nonetheless, that stimulation drives a change. And in this case, the stimulation can be independent of measurement. And so we can just put the electrodes on your head and zap you into a 10 hertz alpha rhythm, for instance, in your brain. We don't have to read the brain first to see where you're at. But, of course, if you combine these things, and if you take the reading and have the feedback be stimulation, can be stimulation and light and sound and whatever else you want. But let's say we avoid the light and sound. We just measure the brain and we have the feedback be stimulation. That's also possible. And so we have basic feedback systems, and we have stimulation, which can and cannot include feedback. And then we have traditional tools. And so that's things like, meditation and cognitive behavioral therapy and things like that. And these are increasingly being used from a technological viewpoint. And so you have heart math, which is on the screen. If you look at the cell phone on the screen, that is heart math, which is designed to measure your heart rate and your heart rate variability, something we'll talk about in a minute, and to basically help you get more easily into a state of meditation. The Muse headband does that as well. It senses your brain waves and works with an app on your phone to do that. And of course, we can consider apps like Calm and Headspace and Insight Timer and things like that. Also, traditional tools, but they're being augmented with technology. So in that case, it's meditation. So we'll see more of that as we go along. We also want to talk about different types of feedback, a little bit more than just the examples that I've given you up to this point. So biased and unbiased are a couple of different categories of feedback. And you can have a few different meanings around this, at least a couple of different meanings around this. So the way you normally hear these being talked about is that the type of feedback is biased by some sort of brain reading or something like that, right? It can also just be an unbiased type of feedback, which means that you're given feedback, but it's more a type of stimulation, really. But it's not necessarily a stimulation that is like, getting your brain zapped with AC current or something like that. It can be a stimulation, a type of feedback involving auditory or visual system stuff, like maybe those binaural beats or isochronic tones that you heard earlier. We also have part-time and full-time types of feedback, and I'm sure that's fairly self-explanatory. If you're using the Muse, for instance, and it's reading your brain waves, and it's constantly providing audio-based feedback in your ear, and you're hearing ocean sounds and birds and things like that, you can tell based on that feedback, that full-time feedback, how you're doing with your meditation based on what Muse thinks, is a good meditation for your brain. And then there's part-time feedback, right? And so you could also have examples where feedback is occasionally taken and then there's adjustments that are made. Now, that's a good example of sort of a mix between biased and unbiased feedback, right? Because if I take a measurement of you, and let's say I think, okay, well, this person really needs more 10 hertz. Then we do a stimulation. Maybe it's audio or video or whatever it is, audio or visual or whatever it is, and it's 10 hertz stimulation, but I'm not measuring during it. That really is an unbiased form of feedback moment to moment. It was, of course, biased by the decision of that initial measurement, but technically, as it's going, it's unbiased because your brain could have changed right away. Or your brain could change at any point in there. And that feedback might not be the optimum feedback for you for the whole time that it's being delivered. So there's part-time examples like that. My favorite part-time example we'll actually see coming up, so I'm going to save it a little bit for that. There's also real-time versus asynchronous. In my last example, real-time would be that Muse example where it's constantly reading your brainwaves, constantly providing feedback. And asynchronous feedback would be, periodic measurements. Or maybe I'm measuring you the whole time, but I'm only showing you at certain intervals where you're at. I'm only giving you sort of a snapshot or feedback at certain intervals for where you're back. Or maybe this is relating to an ongoing feedback regimen. So it's constantly giving you sort of part-time, asynchronous, kind of initially biased, but leading to unbiased during the session feedback, right? And so if we're doing measurement the whole time, but we're only using at the very beginning a sample and then we're giving you some sort of feedback, and then periodically we're reusing the measurements that are happening to recalibrate the feedback, that's a good example of sort of that type of combination. And then again, there's all kinds of different ways to deliver the feedback. Visual, auditory, like we've talked about. Could be flashing lights for visual. Could be the binaural beats or isochronic tones or something like that for auditory. It could also be the bar on the screen for visual. And we talked a little bit about touch and haptics and things like that, vibration on your skin. There's so many more things. You'll see so much more as we go throughout this video presentation. So these are the guys that I wanted to talk about. This is Brian and Cord, and they were students at Hong Kong Polytechnic University around 2010 or so when I was a professor there. This was in the sort of the equivalent of the media lab from MIT in Asia. It was called the M Lab. It was based in Hong Kong. And they had an absolutely fascinating, Brian had a fascinating thesis project for his master's degree. And it incorporated feedback in a very novel way. One of the things that has been an issue with feedback up to this point is that feedback is often the most boring games and screens and stuff like that imaginable. But Brian had a huge animation company and a lot of experience with creating games and stuff like that. And so he was able to think about it in a very different way. You see him wearing a NeuroSky headset. So that's an EEG headset. It's just reading the signal from one point on his forehead. And NeuroSky basically had different signals that they had classified out of that one single sensor on the brainwave. And so they broke the general brainwave down into different frequency bands, and they were able to do all kinds of measurement with it. And one of the things that they were able to do with it was show increased concentration or increased relaxation. And so those were pre-processing signals that they just made available for developers to use. You could also use the raw signal if you wanted to and do fancier stuff. So what Brian wound up doing was creating a game for ADHD people that was a flying game. And you can kind of see it there on the monitor. And it was sort of like this glider, this powered glider that flew over this island. And it was sort of a capture the flag type of thing. And you had these monkeys that were throwing bananas trying to knock you out of the sky. You might be thinking to yourself, oh, I bet you controlled, whether you could go left or right with your brain waves. No. Not at all. In fact, you controlled that with a joystick, and it played like a normal game, and it was an awesomely fun game, actually, that he came up with. Instead, to power the glider, you needed fuel. And occasionally you had to regenerate the fuel by generating a very specific brainwave. Now think about that for a minute. What kind of feedback are we talking about? Just think about those categories for a minute and ask yourself, is this synchronous or asynchronous? Is this part-time or full-time? Biased, not biased? What is this? What are we looking at here? Well, the sensor was constantly reading, so it was full-time signal acquisition, but it only mattered at certain points during the game. And so in this case, it would have been a real-time feedback during those moments in the game, because while you were charging the power bar, you had to generate the brainwaves the whole time. And so that was a real-time form of feedback, but it was part-time in the game because you only had to do it when you were running out of fuel. Now, the amazing thing about this was a huge breakthrough in terms of how things were designed in neurofeedback. And that's why I'm using it as an example, because traditionally the games and stuff, it was all just you just trying to generate this brainwave the whole time, and it was just brutal and it wasn't fun at all. And this was a very clever way to have an amazingly fun, playable game that incorporated feedback only periodically, and it did not detract from the game. It actually added to the fun and the challenge of the game. Now, another thing about games, think about this. You have level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. So eventually, this game was adapted for something called the sensor motor response. That is a very difficult thing to train on with neurofeedback. And you might have to go to a neurofeedback clinician for 40 or 50 sessions. They're brutal. These are kids that are usually doing this for things like ADHD. And it's just horrible. It's a miracle cure that almost no one makes it through to actually realize the benefits of. And so what Brian did was put it into a video game. And if you think about it, if it's really super hard to generate a very precise brainwave frequency, and this is on a strip across the top of the head, so it's pretty easy to pick up with a brainwave sensor, what he could do with level 1 is make it pretty easy. You had to do something really, really easy with your brain to charge the thrusters, to charge the power, to refuel your glider. Then in level 2, it could be just a little bit harder brainwave. Level 3, a little bit harder, all in the direction of getting to that right sensory motor response. So maybe it's not until level 8 or level 9 that you're generating this very accurate sensory motor response. But you've gotten there by playing this game very gently, very fun, Again, an absolute breakthrough in how things were thought about relating to all this. This is another fun one. This is machined to be another's setup, and the idea is basically to put you in another person's shoes. So you can see the setup here. You have someone who's wearing a camera, and it's all servoed up so that as you know, it tracks motion and all of that. So as a person sort of moves their head, it's a dynamic display that the person with the VR is getting. They're really getting a sense that they're looking out of the other person's eyes at themselves wearing the VR headset. You cannot believe how this messes with your brain. Your brain has a tremendous ability to adapt what's called a sense of presence and assume other identities, whether it's a character in a game that's a monster or a spaceship or an octopus or whatever it is. Or in this case, it starts actually feeling like you're this other person. So pretty amazing technology. Here's an example of it sort of in use. You can see the person, holding their eyes up, sort of a slightly more, fancy version of it that two people can be doing at the same time and whatnot. But you're looking at the other person's hands. And so it's a remarkable thing when you get two people with these rigs and whatnot. I hope you get a chance to experience something like this. All of us will be able to experience this very soon, of course, as VR continues its market penetration. But for right now, oftentimes you need a sort of special situation. So let's talk about at a high level, the more popular biosignals that are associated with this. So we've got lots of things that relate to the eyes, like pupil dilation, for instance. Pupil dilation can show cognitive load. Now, of course, you have to be careful because our pupils obviously adapt to light. And so if there's a change in the light, there's going to be a change in pupil dilation. But there's a way to calculate the muscles. There's two different sets of muscles that control opening and closing your iris to make your pupil bigger or smaller. And you can actually measure those muscles independently and get a read on cognitive load. And this is being used a lot in transportation and things like that right now. You're going to see it used a lot in gaming in future years when we've got those VR headsets on our face or those AR glasses on our face and, whatever else. Facial muscles, you can tell a lot about emotion and all sorts of stuff from facial muscles. Probably you're very familiar with that one. Eye blink strength, again, you can tell quite a bit around emotion and arousal and things like that from the strength of someone's eye blinks. Eye tracking, of course, is a huge one. Not just tracking on a screen, but tracking in real life as well. And you can even tell how someone is processing information, what type of information they're processing, all sorts of things from looking at eye tracking data. Galvanic skin response or electrodermal activity is a newer way of saying this, EDA, but you'll probably usually see it in the feedback world as galvanic skin response or GSR. This is that measurement of the electrical resistance in your skin. And so what they do is they put a couple of electrodes on you and they run a little bit of electricity through your skin and they measure the electrical resistance. What does this tell us? This tells us your degree of arousal or relaxation. It's been mapped out to different emotional states and things like that. We'll talk about that a little bit more coming up. But the great thing about GSR is that it is a direct read on your sympathetic nervous system. You probably know that you've got two main parts to your nervous system, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. The sympathetic is your fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic is relaxation. These are often how we think about these. The parasympathetic is really like the brake on the sympathetic. And so the amazing thing about something like GSR is that it allows you to directly and purely train the sympathetic. You don't have to train, you're not training the parasympathetic to put the brakes in the sympathetic, you're directly training the sympathetic. So this is one of the oldest forms of feedback from the modern era. You also have heart rate, of course. And with heart rate, you have something called heart rate variability. Now, heart rate, you can tell a lot about someone from their heart rate, whether they're relaxed, whether they're, exercising, whether they're aroused, but, in a stationary state. There's just all sorts of data that can come from heart rate. And also heart rate variability, which is a measure of the change from one heartbeat to the next. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, don't I want my heartbeats to be as regular as possible? A healthy heart must be a regular heart. That's actually not true. So you actually want a lot of variation in your beat-to-beat intervals between your heartbeats. That comes as a surprise to a lot of people. So as we age, our heart rate variability can go down. If we're out of shape, we can have, difficulty with heart rate variability recovery after some exercise. The closer you get to death, the more regular your heartbeats become. There's a lot of evidence around heart rate variability, everything from longevity to exercise benefits, health, you name it, emotional stuff, all sorts of stuff. So heart rate variability, one of those key signals that's used in transformative technology. Breathing, there's all sorts of breath stuff. There's things like the Spire that you clip on your belt or that you stick inside your clothing and that actually track your breath rate, literally by, sensing when your belly is pushing out, or your chest. If you can also hook it to your bra if you're or even a tight undershirt if you're a man, and it can pick up your chest movements. And so there's so many things that can be determined. You can look up the Calming Technology Lab at Stanford. The people behind the Spire device, and you'll see all kinds of fascinating research about breath and breath patterns and what you can tell from that. Now, there's also breath gases that we can consider. And so you can tell a lot about carbon dioxide percentages and things like that. As you might imagine, that's not so practical from a transformative technology standpoint for mass market adoption, right? But for very specialized devices, it is. Temperature is another one. The warmer you are, the more relaxed you are. The colder you are, the less relaxed you are. So just measuring your peripheral temperature, putting a thermistor on your fingertips, for instance, that can tell us a lot about where you're at. Hormones, neurotransmitters, things like that, blood, these are things that are typically invasive to get at. In other words, you might have to get things from urine, or you might have to do an actual blood draw with a needle in your arm and all of that. And so saliva tests from inside your mouth. There's all different sorts of things that you can use to get these sort of biomarker type of readings. And these are increasingly being used. You're probably also familiar with things like Ubiome, which are taking stool samples, literally samples of your poop, and, providing feedback for you. They're able to provide well-being data about from gut health and stuff, because there's bacterial colonies in your gut that make you happier and ones that make you less happy, and all sorts of stuff. So this is the realm more generally of the clinical type of space. And so you would go to someone and they would do this type of analysis for you, or you would take the sample yourself and you would send it in, and some sort of clinical service would do this analysis for you. But, they're definitely popular these days. Not all of this is going to stay clinical. There's a lot of cutting edge trans tech around, for instance, sending a radio frequency into your arm to detect glucose, the amount of glucose or the amount of nutrients in your bloodstream and things like that. And so you are going to increasingly see these non-invasive type of technologies being able to provide a real-time read of our physiology that relates to our well-being and performance and things like that. That's absolutely being worked on. I think the first time I saw, for instance, the radio frequency one was from someone from the University of Pittsburgh at CES. And that was probably 4 or 5 years ago now. And they were getting a great read on glucose in the blood with RF, which was amazing, and some nutrients and stuff even back then. And so there are lots of companies these days that are trying to work on that all around the world and push that forward. You might not know it. You can get blood pressure from a watch now. That's really been pioneered more in China than it has anywhere else. China's a leader in a lot of these areas. You can tell the condition of your arteries from the data that can be picked up from a sensor on your wrist these days. There's just so much happening. And finally, voice frequency, tonation, language, things like that. There's all sorts of data that you can get from this, especially emotional data, but also health data. A company called Beyond Verbal has something like a 5-year window where they can detect Parkinson's before the medical establishment knows that you're going to get Parkinson's. And it's all from your voice and a voice frequency analysis. So really, really powerful stuff. Okay, let's look at a longer list and just maybe pick up some other things. I didn't want to overwhelm you on the last slide. I didn't want our first slide to be like, oh my God, look at that list. So I thought I would save it for a second slide here. But a lot of these we've already talked about: HRV, GSR, peripheral skin temperature, voice entrainment and analysis. That's the idea of that vocal processing. And you can download an app called Moody's, Moodis, from Beyond Verbal, and mess around with it for free on your phone. And you can see how well it analyzes your voice for your mood. There's lots of things like that out there now. And of course, it benefits the companies because it helps them to expand their data set. They'll ask you for feedback. Hi, how accurate is this? And that kind of thing. Eye tracking. EMG is one that we didn't talk about. This is muscle relaxation. And so you can have some sensors that are put on your skin and that can determine how relaxed your muscles are. And so if you wind up being someone with a very tight physiology, there are some products in the marketplace that you can buy. You literally just stick them over your muscles that you have difficulty relaxing, and they usually have a smartphone app with them. And that smartphone app provides you feedback, and it's a form of biofeedback and creates a loop between that muscle-based sensor, that EMG sensor, your cell phone, and you, the rest of your physiology, your conscious mind, all of that, and helping you to learn to consciously relax that muscle and keep it relaxed. Breath-related stuff we've talked about, EEG and neurofeedback we've talked about. Spatial and other audio stimulation technologies. So in addition to things like the binaural beats that we talked about earlier, the isochronic tones that we talked about earlier, there's really fancy stuff coming out that basically allows you to have a spatially represented sound field. And this is really being pioneered for VR more than anything else, because if you're in virtual reality and you have this 3D space that you're in, but the sound field is not 3D, if it sounds like everything is just right in your ear or everything is right ahead of you or something, even when you can see an object is off to your left, well, that's no good for the experience, right? And so they're working really hard on getting these spatial technologies in place. Well, guess what? Those spatial technologies can be used to advance things like isochronic tones, binaural beats, and new things that are being discovered to profoundly affect our mood and our state of consciousness and our well-being and all of that. And so that's a really cutting edge coming up area. Transcranial ultrasound, focus ultrasound. I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier. It's the idea of putting a sound pressure wave through the skull to actually specifically affect certain areas of the brain in very highly specific ways. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Vagal nerve stimulation. This is, again, using either electrical or acoustical stimulation of the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is called the wandering nerve. It goes all throughout the body. It's one of the cranial nerves that comes out of the brain, and it basically goes to your voice box. It goes to your digestive area. It's what puts represents a lot of the parasympathetic nervous system, the part that dampens down the sympathetic nervous system. I mean, this is an incredibly important superhighway in your body. It's being used for all sorts of stuff medically, but on the transformative technology side, we're seeing lots of benefits around it being able to help people relax that have otherwise very difficult circumstances for that. Maybe they have very intense anxiety, things like that. It's, different signals that basically you can put into the vagus nerve using these different technologies, non-invasive technologies. In the medical field, they'll often implant wires and stuff around, or electrodes right onto the vagus nerve, and they'll just directly stimulate the vagus nerve, and they'll put an implant in that is the device that has the chipset that sends the signal and all of that. It's a really invasive process, but it works miracles for people with very difficult, to resolve conditions and things like that. In our case, for TransTech, we're talking about just stuff you maybe just hold to your neck, or it can be a collar or something that goes around you and just puts the electrodes right here. If you think about headphones that you've seen, there are some bone induction headphones that come around behind the neck, and you put them right on the mastoid bone right behind your ear. Well, guess what? You put those down on your neck, and now you've got a magnetic stimulation device for the vagus nerve. And it's one of our first TransTech companies. In the early days of vagus nerve stimulation, that's exactly what they used. So there's really good stuff out there for vagal nerve stimulation. That's going to be a very powerful area. Audio and visual entrainment. So that's things like you put on some glasses and they got some flashing LEDs, and they entrain your brain using photonic brain wave entrainment, which just means light flashing in your eyes produces a certain response in your brain that entrains you to a certain frequency. And that frequency is for something. It's for relaxation, or it's for focus, or it's for whatever. So that's visual entrainment. You can also do that with auditory entrainment. Again, the binaural beats, the isochronic tones, things like that. Lots of AI is being built into all of these. So a lot of these things, like what I just talked about with the visual and audio entrainment, they have been around forever, right? It's people dancing around fires. But the glasses and the headphones and stuff like that, those have been around since the late 60s, early 70s, and the 70s, and really becoming more popular in the 80s when some marketers got a hold of them and really sort of spread them more broadly throughout the population. Well, now those things are being supercharged by AI, and especially feedback. And so they'll take feedback from maybe your heart rate variability or brain waves or GSR or whatever, and it'll get crunched with artificial intelligence, and the feedback that it's able to provide, the stimulation that's able to provide, is way more powerful than ever before. And in fact, that's a lot of what we're seeing here. We're seeing there's a device called Feel, for instance, that measures a number of different biosignals. So, it's got the ability to do heart rate and GSR and things like that. And what they're seeing is any one of these alone is okay, but it's a lot better if you've got data from multiple sensors that you can throw into an AI engine and really just get it to produce a gold mine of data on each person, because every person is slightly different in these signals. And so artificial intelligence and multiple sensors is really the name of the game these days, and it's what's allowing us to take all of this to the next level. So it's hardware and software in a marriage. Virtual reality, I'm sure you know about virtual reality at this point. We saw a little bit in The Machine to Be Another. You saw the virtual reality headset. It's an immersive headset that you wear. Usually it's an immersive audio and video experience. Sometimes even more than that. They have haptic vests and things that can track your hands so that your fingers are accurately represented and your arm movements are accurately represented. All sorts of stuff these days. You can, if you get hit by a gun in a first-person shooter or something in VR, and you're wearing a haptic vest, you can feel the hit from the haptic vest that you're wearing, and just amazing stuff that's being done with VR these days. It's such an immersive technology. That's what's great about it. Video games. I gave you an example of Brian Ho's video game for helping people with ADHD, which is called Wind Chaser. Of course, lots of apps. I talked about Headspace and Calm, but there's a whole bunch more out there. You'll see them a little bit later in this presentation. Biosynchrony is how I'm going to refer to this in this case, it's a physics term, it has certain meanings, but how we use it in trans tech is really biosynchrony across people. And so this would be the idea that you all go in for a meeting, you go in with your team for a meeting, and you do something before that meeting that really sort of syncs up your biology and gets you in an optimum state to work together. Maybe you use heart maths devices all connected to each other. Or maybe you use a brainwave sensing headband. And so there's something called focus band where you can have multiple ones of them hooked together, and you sort of, get your brainwaves all going in a very specific way prior to the meeting or whatever. But there's some sort of biosynchrony between you. And this can also be between partners. We'll see a little later on. Really interesting device that was created was one that was applied to the belly of a pregnant woman, and then you had another haptics device that went on a man, and every time the baby kicked, the man felt it, right? So that's a different form of biosynchrony, sort of a powerful emotional biosynchrony between people. The microbiome, huge these days. And I think a lot of people, when they think about the microbiome, only think about the gut microbiome. They only think about, what's in our intestines. And there's been so much press around that. But your entire body is a microbiome. You have a microbiome on your skin. There's different things for different parts of your skin. There's facial, you might not know this, but there's facial sprays that you can buy to restore your facial microbiome after you wash your face to get the dirt and makeup and whatever else off with soap. And so microbiome is a big, big area. It's a huge emerging area in transformative technology. So much of it relates to, well-being in addition to physical health and all sorts of other stuff. All right, we talked about the photonic stimulation for eyes and for visual entrainment, but you can also do it for your whole body. You can do it with a headset shooting infrared light through your brain. So you can just put a headset on the outside of your head with the right wavelengths of light, and it can actually penetrate the skull. It's what's called a therapeutic window for the light. So it will penetrate the skull, go into your brain, and actually affect the processing in your brain. Amazing, right? Photonic stimulation also being used. You've probably seen the LED panels and the infrared panels and stuff like that people are standing in front of to basically rejuvenate their skin cells. Well, there's also ones that help with well-being. So photonic stimulation is a huge major area. And then you've got a bunch of different types of direct brain stimulation. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about these later on. And so I'm not going to cover them too much right now. Let me just say transcranial direct current stimulation, or TDCS, is basically done with DC current. And so is high definition transcranial direct current stimulation. And then transcranial alternating current stimulation, random noise stimulation, cranial electrotherapy stimulation, pulsed current stimulation. Those are all done with AC current. And then you can also put a magnetic pulse through this, which is also, of course, driven off of an AC circuit in most cases. Okay, I'm going to talk more about those. I'll have some specific slides for more on that a little bit later, because those are ones that I'm pretty sure you've heard of, and you might just be interested in knowing a little bit more about. So let's start by looking at TDCS stimulation. And it's basically just like putting a 9-volt battery to your head. You've got an anode, which is the positive pole, and a cathode, which is the negative pole. And basically current flows from the anode to the cathode. And this does not make your brain fire. So you can't make neurons in your brain fire with this. What you do with this is you condition your brain and a specific region of your brain, in most cases, to be more or less likely to fire. So that's it. That's what it does. It says this is more likely to fire or less likely to fire. But you have to do it in conjunction with something. If you just put a TDCS device on your head, and you just sit around and do nothing for 20 minutes, you're basically not going to get any benefit out of having done that stimulation. You've got to pair it with a task, a learning task, a motor task, maybe learning to shoot baskets and basketball a little bit better, or could be all kinds of different stuff. These are used a lot for motor learning. In fact, the Marines, the U.S. Marines, which is a branch of the U.S. military, if you're not familiar with it, they train their soldiers during basic training to learn to shoot 30% faster with this type of technology. So it's been really, really helpful for things like motor learning and whatnot. You see a hacky device. Literally, you can just go and get like a few bucks in parts and a 9-volt battery and make one of these. In fact, the first one I ever used, that's exactly what we did in Hong Kong. And then TACS, the difference between TACS and TDCS is that with an AC signal, you can actually modulate the signal. And so with an AC signal, you can, instead of just making something more or less likely to fire, you can actually make the brain synchronize to the signal in some way, which means since you can oscillate the signal, you could oscillate it, say, 10 hertz, like we've been talking about throughout the whole video. And you can induce in someone a deeper state of meditation by having a TACS device. Again, you have an anode and a cathode. You just basically put those on. You can see on your screen in the top right corner there, the cortical stimulation, and he's got an anode on the head, and then he's got another one. It should be blue, but it's shown as red, but whatever. I'll just say that's the cathode, and it's on the shoulder. So they don't even have to both be on the head. There's all sorts of, as you might imagine, knowledge about placement and lots of experiments that have been done putting both TACS and TDCS electrodes over different parts of the brain and what they do and things like that. But at a basic level, I just wanted you to understand at a simple level the difference between these technologies, which is that with DCS, really all you're doing is you're making a region of the brain more or less likely to fire in conjunction with something that you're doing. And that can lead to long-term benefits like increases in learning and stuff like that. It could also have mood effects, all sorts of things. TACS is usually used in situations where you're reading a person's brainwaves and you're like, you know what? They could really use a little bit more of this frequency. Well, let's just directly inject that frequency into the part of the brain that needs it through the skull by sticking an electrode on the outside of their brain and just generating the right signal. And then, basically the neurons in that area will synchronize up with that signal. You're still not really it's not a really strong jolt to the brain. You're not making the neurons fire per se, but the neurons are kind of syncing up to that signal. Here's transcranial ultrasound. It used to be used in the way you see on the left side of the screen. And this was to actually burn out sections in your brain. Yeah, so this is a powerful technology. You got to be really careful with this. And what they would do is they would triangulate to a section of brain very deep in. And so they would have 3 transducers or more. There would really be thousands of transducers in the later versions of these. They would guide it in usually with a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine. And they would bring all of those transducers to a single point, create an interference pattern, heat up the tissue there from literally physically modulating the tissue. These are sound waves. And so they're literally, they're putting a pressure wave through the brain, like they're sort of shaking the brain, if you will. Very different than the other technologies, which were like electrical based. They related to the electrical signals, the electrical properties of the brain. This is a physical, mechanical thing. And so it's inducing this in the brain. They would burn out tumors. They still do this. Certainly it's a lot better than having your skull cracked open and having somebody, separate out a bunch of areas of your brain and reach in and grab the tumor. This just very precisely zaps it deep in the brain. Well, how does that relate to TransTech? Because we're not into brain surgery, right? On the lower right part of your screen is Stuart Hameroff, and Stuart may have been one of the very first people to look at the modulatory effects of ultrasound. He's a doctor, as you can tell. He's an anesthesiologist, and he has a theory of consciousness that relates to microtubules in the brain, quantum physics, with a Nobel laureate from the UK. We're definitely not going there in this video, but a physicist named Anirban Banapati, who was at MIT at the time, now at a leading institute in Japan, wound up measuring microtubules, and Stewart realized, holy cow, I could modulate those potentially with ultrasound. He's looking around the hospital. He's got these ultrasound machines, right, for detecting, whether you're still bleeding from a stroke or how your baby is doing in the womb and all of that, right? So he's like, well, let's see what happens if I stick one of these on my head. And he put it on his temple because that's the thinnest part of the skull. And he noticed that he was immediately getting a sense of well-being from it. And so he's like, holy cow, there's something to this maybe. And he did some studies on it. He did some of the first studies on it. You see the reference there back in 2012. And lo and behold, this has become a thing. There's a lot of cutting edge research being done around transcranial ultrasound now. And you see in the top right-hand side an early hacker pioneer, not a scientist, a filmmaker who decided he was going to start messing around with this technology using baby monitors he bought off eBay and just all kinds of stuff. Now, he was a programmer and an amateur electronics guy and, all that in all fairness. But he nonetheless wound up creating an instrument that was used by researchers. Created a company called Berkeley Ultrasound, which operated for a number of years and had one of the first units that researchers could use. And so ultrasound has really been experimented with from this hacky type community all the way up to leading world-class consciousness researchers like Stu. Stimulation. This is that photobiomodulation that I was talking about, where you have these therapeutic light windows. And this is what the headset looks like. And you might think, what's the thing with the nose? Well, there's actually a great pathway to part of the brain up the nasal cavity. And so that is another LED that shines up the nasal cavity to hit that part of the brain. And you can see that represented on the left side of the screen. And so what these do is that you can adjust these where these lights go. And you can put them over different parts of the brain and things like that. By default, usually the companies are putting them over something called the default mode network and the key nodes in the default mode network, which is a network of regions in the brain that relate to your sense of self and have a lot to do with, your happiness and things like that. So the fascinating thing about this is that not only can you modulate brain activity by flashing these LEDs, so you can do the same 10 hertz thing, just to keep picking on the same example, and you could flash these at 10 hertz, for example, and you would modulate the brainwave activity at 10 hertz, but you also get a side benefit. It turns out that this affects the ATP cycle in the cells in your brain that are picking up this light. And so it actually affects the cellular energy cycle in your brain. So that you get sort of a dual benefit. And we're seeing this being increasingly researched and used in things like Alzheimer's and traumatic brain injury cases. But on the TransTech non-clinical side of the fence, it's really amazing for things like cognitive decline as we age. And so by your early 50s, you're starting to enter cognitive decline. Well, how incredible is it? There's now a headset that you can wear that, helps to feed your brain energy directly using light, allows you to entrain it with specific frequencies that, help it to, stabilize or even reverse cognitive decline, things like that. So this is a real comer of a technology. You can look up a company called Vielight, Vielight, out of Canada. They're really the world leaders in this. If you're interested in it, really good stuff. I think many of you know at the TransTech Lab, we have done a lot of applied research on this type of stuff. And so I thought I might show you our own stimulation research arc, which started with getting a handle on what was happening that we might want to change, right? So we're interested in the highest forms of human well-being. That's what we work on. We work on trying to generate in people, trying to help people get as safely, reliably, and rapidly as possible into the greatest and sort of best forms of human well-being. We call that fundamental well-being. So you can see our arc over the years. It's gone through fMRI to measure the brain of people that experienced fundamental well-being, and then real-time feedback with fMRI. That's what RT-fMRI stands for. And in that situation, you take in, grad students and stuff, right? And you would mark off the areas in the brain that were significant in the people in the previous research phase that had fundamental well-being, and you would, provide them with some sort of neurofeedback and try to get them to modulate their brain waves, try to get them to modulate either their brain waves or, in this case with fMRI, their brainwave activity, the amount of blood flow going to a region. So just more or less activity, so that it was more like the fundamental well-being people, and try to see, okay, well, are those areas in the brain really related to fundamental well-being? And then we did that, moved on to do that with EEG. And so measuring the electrical signals coming from the brain, MEG, the magnetic signals coming from the brain. And then it's down to, well, are there stimulation techniques that can use with this? So the transcranial magnetic stimulation one we didn't talk about, which is a very powerful, it's clinical. You have to have a doctor's prescription. You have to go to a doctor's office usually to have it done. But it's a very powerful magnetic pulse. It's a big figure-8 coil. You might have seen it on TV. It covers like half the head practically. It does generate neural activity. It can fire neurons in the brain. So it can make your fingers twitch and your arm twitch and stuff like that, because it literally externally fire those. So that type of stimulation, deeper forms of TMS, which is just different coils to reach deeper into the brain. That's what DTMS is. And then TDCS and TACS. And in our case, for fundamental well-being, the regions of interest in the brain were too deep. So we went through all of those different types of stimulation, but we couldn't reach them because all of those affect too shallow an area in the brain. They can get to the surface of the brain, but not really deep in the brain, where our regions of interest were from the fMRI work and from the EEG measurement. And so we could do it with feedback, but that wound up being very convoluted, really expensive, real-time fMRI feedback, super expensive proposition. So finally, our current phase is transcranial focused ultrasound. And so that's what, let me show you a picture here. This is Jay Sanguinetti. I really feel like Jay is in the absolutely top echelon of people who are experimenting with transcranial ultrasound today. And that is Shinzen Young, the meditator. Shinzen came to Jay a number of years ago, now I guess maybe a couple of years ago, so not too long ago, and said, hey, I'd like you to use ultrasound on this one region of my brain that I think might relate to helping people meditate better. Shinzen reads a lot of neuroscience literature and stuff like that, and so he felt like, well, maybe if you could just zap this area, let's see what'll happen. And as you might imagine, Jay, being a serious scientist, was reluctant to just zap a relatively old person's brain. But Shinzen was persistent, and he wound up doing it, and it wound up working actually to help with meditation. And you can see the part of the brain that's being targeted on the screen actually in this image. This was an image from the TransTech lab. We had Jay come and work with us for a number of months and get us all set up. That is actually the first targeting machine in the world that we had at the TransTech lab, still have for this. Now this company has sold that technology to other people. Jay has one at his lab at the University of Arizona, as an example. And you've got researchers all over the world now who are working on transcranial ultrasound and for all kinds of stuff, Parkinson's, addiction, you name it. Lots of medical and clinical conditions. In our case, we're interested in this for well-being, and specifically for fundamental well-being. And we did a year-long project that ended in August of 2019 or so. And that project really looked at whether or not it was possible to put people into fundamental well-being with transcranial ultrasound. And in fact, it was. And so Jay's now back at the University of Arizona. He's working with Tim Mullen, who's still affiliated with UCSD, has a company called Intheon. And they're sort of leaders in signal processing of biosignals. And so they're trying to get a closed loop system. They're working on advancing the science. At TransTech Lab, we're still working on advancing the applications of it. There's all kinds of people working on advancing the clinical application and science of it. It's really good stuff that's happening. I thought this is a really good example. Okay, let's talk just briefly about some additional ones here, some other companies and whatnot. So you've got things like the Oura Ring, which measures your pulse, measures your heart rate, and heart rate variability and stuff from literally a ring. So you have to get it properly sized and all of that for you. And some other ones there. Sauna, which is a biofeedback, auditory, and visual-based sleep assistance system. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can go and look them up on your own. Then there's all sorts of apps for meditation. I've been talking about Muse. There's a picture of the Muse headband. And again, that works in a loop, in a feedback loop. It reads your brain waves and works in a feedback loop with an application. Then there's other things that are just tech apps, basically, like Headspace and Calm and Insight Timer and whatnot, that help with guided meditations. You have some what are called amplified therapists, and these are basically either services that help you to find therapists or to connect with therapists more easily. It might do it over chat or an app or something like that. Or it might be AI-based CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or other types of psychological interventions that instead of actually having a therapist on the other side, you might have an AI platform on the other side. Or you might have some combination of an AI platform and therapists, depending upon what you need at a given moment as determined by the app. Stress management, you see down there, there's the Spire. That was the original Spire that clips on the belt that measures your respiration. Leaf does the same. It can do respiration. It also does heart rate variability. Spire has a new product out that actually sticks inside your clothing, so you don't have to clip anything on. You can stick it inside your underwear or something like that, and it can go through the wash a bunch of times, and it's got a pretty long life and whatnot. So that's a lot of innovation happening in these spaces. And then you have corporate platforms. So things like Will, for instance, that really try to aggregate together the best practices that are out there and provide training for corporations. We're doing a lot of work within TransTech trying to help corporation and corporate HR departments really understand what transformative technology can do for their employees and how important it is as part of an overall employee well-being management type of system. Emotion recognition, different ways of doing that beyond verbal. I mentioned them earlier. That was the voice analysis company. Affectiva, also using biosignals and whatnot to sort of get at emotional recognition type of signal processing and feedback. You have mood management, so there's some positive psychology integrated into the Happify app, just as one example, looking at some of the best practices coming out of the positive psychology movement, and which is an academic movement. I mean, it's a serious part of the psychology research establishment these days in universities, and these people are operationalizing it basically in an app. Behavior change, so you've got something like Pavlok, which is kind of a funny one. It actually shocks you. So it's designed it's sort of like the Pavlovian response, right? Hence Pavlok. If you are familiar with Pavlov was a Russian researcher around the turn of the century who basically discovered, didn't discover so much, but played an integral role in advancing our understanding of something called behaviorism, which, that was when, you've probably heard the example of it, where, you give the dog food, you give a dog food, and the dog, of course, salivates and eats the food, right? If you ring a bell while you're giving the dog food, it pairs in the nervous system of the dog the bell and the food. So if you later just ring the bell, the dog will salivate because it expects to be getting food. And if you give the dog food with the bell, that process keeps going. That nervous system process, that loop keeps happening in the dog. If you stop giving the dog food and you just keep ringing the bell, eventually the nervous system of the dog figures out, oh, hey, wait a minute. Maybe food and bell don't go together all the time. I guess I don't need to salivate when I hear a bell anymore. So that was Pavlov's core basic research. A lot of his more advanced research actually didn't make it into English translation. You've got to go back and read it in the French. People were publishing in the French Academy at the time. They were sort of the world leaders around the turn of the century from an academic standpoint. And so Pavlov was actually publishing in French. And he did a lot of stuff around well-being with those dogs that was never translated into sort of our English understanding of behaviorism or whatnot, kind of interestingly. So this is a device, works with your phone, with an app, and you basically tell it, either you can self-shock yourself or you can tell it to shock you based on certain gestures that you make. So let's say you want to stop smoking. And there's a certain gesture that it can detect when you're bringing the cigarette to your mouth. So it will shock you during that gesture, things like that. Then we've got things that can help you with focus, and these include supplements. There are also well-being supplements. There are mood supplements, all of that, of course. We're just bringing that in here as an example. So Neurohacker is a good example of somebody focusing on smart pills. There's TDCS. Focus is a TDCS-based device that can focus is one of the things that can come out of TDCS. Mood, focus, learning, all sorts of different things. And then Focus at Will. This is pretty neat. This is an online service. It's in an app as well. And you basically listen to the music that they generate, which is beautiful music produced by a guy who was the AMP. I can't think of it at the moment. But it's the association that is all of the recording artists and producers and stuff. He's basically been their Songwriter of the Year. He's written, I think, the 5th most popular song in English and history, things like that. So the music is good. It's really, really good. And it's incredible. It basically is really sophisticated mathematics and analysis and whatnot. And it keeps you in a flow state when you listen to it. So just a stunning technology. It's all over. I'm sitting in Silicon Valley as I make this video. It's all over Silicon Valley. Like you walk through Facebook, you walk through Google, people have Focus on Will in their headsets, their heads down coding in that flow state. Emotion tracking, I really like HeartMath and Feel here. Feel is a comer. They're not out yet. But I've mentioned them earlier. They were one of the ones that have multiple things that they're able to read. So they're able to do GSR and heart rate, and an AI platform mashes it all together, etc. HeartMath is really the granddaddy of the whole space. For all of this, they didn't make the early light and sound machines or anything like that, but they were the first ones on heart rate variability. We really use heart rate variability in a trans tech space because of HeartMath, fundamentally. Lots of AR/VR applications, you might imagine, for getting over phobias, and the machine to be and other stuff to really sort of kind of mess with your sense of self. And VR is, of course, a huge, huge comer. It's going to be used for all kinds of stuff. A neat one that I like is it's being used in burn units. And there's one great example of that is there's this game where you're like in the Arctic and you're penguins and you're throwing snowballs. And that actually just dramatically reduces pain during skin grafts and healing from skin grafts and things like that. Remarkable use of an immersive technology. You're just going to see more and more and more of that. Pattern recognition. So this is oftentimes data aggregators from different things. And again, trying to use AI to really optimize your life in different ways. You might be surprised to think of Alexa as a transformative technology, but it absolutely is. One of the top things that Alexa is asked is for help with relaxation. People get home and they say, Alexa, help me relax. So much so that Amazon has worked with people like Deepak Chopra to create solutions for Alexa to say back to people when they say that. And so this whole type of intelligence assistance, this whole type of area, integrated with increasing our biosensors and our phone data and all sorts of stuff, it's just such a comer. Really integrating things into our life. Trip is another VR. And it's bills itself as the first mood-altering VR, really. So you can, subscribe and you can become happy or sad or focused or whatever. They are unbelievable. Their technology is absolutely world-class, industry-leading. Neurostimulation. So here are some examples of neurostimulation. Focus there, of course. Fisher-Wallace, really the granddaddy of that space, with a transcranial stimulator, an AC stimulator device for depression. You see Halo there with their various headsets, lots of That is focused on sports performance and flow state and things like that these days. So there's all kinds of great neurostimulation. I really love the healthy, calming space stuff that's coming out. And so, there's cork flooring that's good on your back and your joints and stuff. Engineered circadian lighting so that the lighting matches what would be more normal for our bodies over the course of a day. Scents that are dispersed based on our desired emotions can be based on neurofeedback and biofeedback type stuff. Same with soundscapes. Just imagine your home with all of these technologies integrated, knowing where you're at, knowing where you want to be at, and just wrapping you in it, right? That's really where this is all going. Your home, your car, it's all going to be able to do it. Food, precision food, food that's based on your genome profiles, and it can also be based on your digestion profiles. There are TransTech devices that you blow in that basically track your how well you're digesting different types of food. So there's all types of stuff happening there. Gut biome, we've talked a lot about that. And with haptics, I think we've talked enough about that as well. There's a picture, incidentally, of the guy crying as he feels his baby kicking. And the touch rings, those are super cool. They allow you to feel another person's heartbeat. And so you could use them as wedding rings, for instance, and you could feel your husband or wife's heartbeat wherever you are in the world, as long as there's internet connectivity. Then there's things like Neuromore, or I mentioned earlier Tim Mullen's platform, which is absolutely incredible, but a little bit harder to get access to as I'm making this video. Nonetheless, you can look it up. Neuromore is a signal integration platform, right? So now we're really talking about middleware. We're talking about what allows you to more easily integrate this stuff. And it's going to be increasingly about these signal processing pipelines. So there's this one, there's Tim Mullen's. The whole point of these is to basically have the AI, the signal acquisition, all of that done for you. You don't have any coding to do to create it. You just basically have drag and drop pipelines. You basically say, I want this signal from this device. I want to run it through this type of processing. I want to spit it out here. I want to drive this with it. Whether it's gameplay that you're driving or an LED that you're driving or, whatever. We have a whole giant list of these, which you probably already know about at TransTech 200. We consider these the industry leaders. And so you'll find people like Tim and Neuromore and really everybody we've talked about on the list. I also want to tell you about something that you're, I think, probably going to be interested in. This falls in the traditional realm. So last year, I was supposed to co-teach a class at Stanford with a friend of mine on meditation and technology. And it didn't quite work out. And so I wound up, it was a scheduling, sort of thing, and it was kind of complicated. And so I thought, you know what, I'll just make a course that he can assign as homework in the online course system. And so we created a meditation and technology class that was based on all of our research at the Transformative Technology Lab and the other places that I've been affiliated with over time. So if you're wondering why this looks like an undergraduate from Stanford, that's why. That's where this logo comes from, right? I tried to sort of make it appeal to them. One of the things that I thought would be really good to do is make that available more widely. And so we're just about to release this more widely. And what it deals with is it basically walks you through figuring out the best type of meditation for you. That's really the very hardest thing to figure out in terms of meditation. Not all forms of meditation work. Some work a lot better than others. And just having a list of the ones that work the best is not enough, because you really have to figure out which one works for you. And that's been a huge limit on the growth of meditation to this point. And so what we wanted to do for these Stanford students was to really create a course for them that would help them to figure out over just a couple of weeks or so of trying something different every day, following the course protocol, to help them really figure out what worked for them. Well, this experiment really has turned out to be incredibly effective. And so we're going to start selling this class more broadly. And I wanted to make it available to you guys because it also has a transformative technology component to it. Because it was a meditation and technology class at Stanford, we included our current favorite device, feedback, right? And so we're like, we recommend this HRV sensor. We recommend this brainwave sensor. We recommend, and so on. And so there's a meditation section of the course that basically helps you to figure out your optimum meditation. As far as I know, it's the only thing in the world that does that. And that's, again, as far as we can tell from a research standpoint, the single most important thing when it comes to learning meditation. So it's a little crazy that that wasn't invented hundreds of years ago and isn't popular worldwide or whatever. But it really, the reason is actually quite simple. It took a global reach. It took the internet coming online and the first huge global meditation studies that we've done and all of that in order to really be able to figure out, holy cow, this is just a matching game. And so it stands on the shoulders of all of that work that has been put into all of these really great meditation methods around the world. But if you were in the Middle Ages in Europe and your only meditation option was contemplative prayer in the Christian tradition, and you weren't and that's a great method. That works really, really well for, a few percent of people, right? Unfortunately, if you weren't in that few percent of people, you were never going to have luck with that method, right? So some people had tremendous luck with it. Awesome method. Other people, not so much. And so it really took our research coming along, having this global look at all of this to realize, oh my gosh, this is a matching game. And now for the first time in human history, we can pull all of these gold standard methods together in one place and help people figure out which one's for them. And then, again, because it was a technology class, it's got a second module on our best recommendations for devices and signals and how to think about the signals and how to use them and all of that. So very, very relevant to those of you that are taking the Academy. We're not actually, as I'm making this video, we're not actually selling it to the public yet. We're going to be doing that soon, but we're not doing it right now. And when we do, it's going to be around $400. And so I created a link for you guys, and you can order it and, test it out. What I hope you'll do is give us some feedback on it. So you can expect, if you take advantage of this offer, you can expect to hear from us. And we're going to want to know intimate details about how it worked out for you, just like we're doing with the students that take it. Okay, so, this is a video. You can pause it. So if you haven't written this link down, you can come back to it. Let me just say one final thing here, and that is one of the things to pay attention to in this trans tech area is key trends. And so here's a few key trends. Things are trending away from hardware and towards software. It's important as you're thinking about your businesses, right? Would I go into the hardware business today? It would have to be a really unique hardware thing like transcranial ultrasound, right? Something that I just couldn't do any other way. So I would, but it would have to be a really, really special case. The Feel wristband, it's a great example of a special case. Multiple signals in one place. You can't get them from a phone. You can't get them from any other device very easily. I can't have somebody just go and order it and then buy my software and do something special with it. So that's another great example. But generally speaking, the space is trending towards hardware advancements, especially AI type advancements and whatnot. It's also tending to move more into the background. What do I mean by that? I mean, it's tending to be more of an unconscious bias than a conscious bias, right? And so where it used to just show you a bunch of, oh, my heart rate variability is blah, 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 right? And people would think, what do I do with that, right? I mean, what does that even mean? So the quantified self movement, was all about getting all this biomeasurements, when you had to be a real nerd to figure out, and you had to spend an enormous amount of your time, kind of not have a life, in order to really make maximum use of that, right? Well, it's perhaps not surprising that as these things become commercialized and as they're pushed out into the mainstream, these things are becoming more simple to use, but they're also becoming more backgrounded. So think about those apps that take all kinds of stuff. They might take bio data, they might take your life logging, stuff from your calendar, where you've been from your GPS, all of that, all of this information about you, maybe even your purchase history if you give it access to your credit cards and bank account and stuff like that. And it forms suggestions for you. It's like, hey, you know what? Tuesday mornings, maybe not the best time for you to meet with your boss. Just think about it. Just a little advice there. Thursday afternoons, great time to meet with your boss, right? And so it just learns more and more and more and more about us, but it really does a lot of that in the background and a lot of that in a more integrated way. Another example, just slight interface changes. So you might have a color temperature change in an interface. You don't even notice the temperature. You don't even notice the color change, but your mind and your body does. And so it's a way to provide a subliminal form of feedback. It's backgrounded based on some sensors. Maybe it's something, maybe you have essential tremor or Parkinson's or something like that to go clinical. And, it's taking data from your accelerometer for how much you're shaking your phone. And it's doing a very subtle reprogramming of your nervous system, trying to knock those hard edges off of those conditions to try to get your nervous system to entrain to be just a little more calm, just a little more regulated. Pointing out, just from a change in the interface on the colors of your phone, right? And it's like, it's still blue. You can't tell it's a different shade of blue, but your nervous system can tell it's a different shade of blue, right? It's another example of how things are going to be increasingly background. You're going to have signals embedded in audio, signals embedded in visual streams, stuff like that. So there's this general trend away from like, my heart rate variability is 3 point blah, 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 right? To much more useful data. And as a function of that much more useful data, things being increasingly backgrounded and just made a part of the water, part of the air, just a part of our normal operating tech environment. And then the last one there, which is sort of, again, away from measurement and towards programmatic coaching. And that's an example of things being useful. But there's one other way that I want to talk about programmatic coaching in relation to TransTech, and that is if you're in the device business, one of the things that has been noticed and made popular in the last year or so, from Pavlok to others, to Feel, to you name it, has been actual coaching. So having coaching programs. So it's not necessarily just enough to sell a device. You also have to, Muse is a great example of AI-based, phone, software-driven programmatic coaching. But that programmatic coaching can also be real people that are actual coaches that use your device, that take input from your device and can tell something about a person and can help that person with a coaching program, an educational video series with one-on-one coaching tied to it or something like that. And that has become increasingly popular with devices like Pavlok, which does a lot of it around new behaviors and breaking habits and stuff like that. Pairing their device with a coaching program has led to a significant increase in their commercial success. So that's another way I want you to think about this. Another trend that's coming out. If you're thinking hardware and you're thinking, whatever else, and maybe you're thinking all Muse, right? You're thinking, I'm going to go the Muse model. It's going to be hardware and it's going to be all AI and programmatic and, okay, fine. But there's another form of programmatic coaching, the old school of programmatic coaching, with actual humans, and you should not rule that out. All right, that's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to be with you, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the Academy.